and welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to talk about is capturing Cloudflow metadata during runtime execution. Let's go. So I've been getting a lot of questions lately just regarding custom logging, certainly in RPA scenarios where you want to be able to really track what is going on with your flows, the success, the failures, and some business context related to those transactions. Now, as part of the logging requirements, what commonly comes up is just the ability to get those details about the workflow or the flow itself that is being executed. Now, there is an expression called workflow that helps us retrieve all of this runtime details. Now, what we're going to see is when we get into more content here that this workflow will return essentially a JSON message that has a couple nodes within it. But the good news is we can use JSON path to extract specific details from this payload itself, which allows us to retrieve those individual attributes. And if we were going to publish those individual fields through, say, a connector, we would have the ability to go ahead and do so. Before we dive deeper into the content, I wanted to let you know about an emerging community found at serverlessnotes.com. This is a community resource that covers best practices, tips, and latest announcements built on contributions by technology enthusiasts from around the globe. On serverlessnotes.com, you'll find content related to Power Automate, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Service Bus, Azure Functions, and much, much more. Serverlessnotes.com is brought to you by Serverless 360, a portal that is focused on operations and support for Microsoft Azure serverless resources. Now, this is a complementary tool to the Azure portal, and it helps organizations in supporting Azure serverless applications. You can find out more about Serverless 360 at serverless360.com. Okay, so here we are. What I have here is essentially the output from our workflow expression. Now, where do you find the workflow expression? Just click in any input. In this case, I'm using a compose. And then go ahead and in the expression type in workflow and it will come up for you. Do note you have the opening and closing parentheses. Now let's take a closer look at what's inside this specific expression. Number one is name. So we've got the internal flow identifier. And so what I'm going to do is I will show you in the URL of the flow what this value represents. So do note it starts with 36 and ends in D3. But this essentially is our flow identifier. It is in an attribute called name, but it's essentially our flow ID. Naturally, we also want to be able to capture the display name, and we can go ahead and see that here. We've got the name of my flow is called get flow metadata. And what's really important to note is that this value here is immutable. It will not change, but you can always change your flow display name. So I could go change my flow display name, run this again, and this value is going to remain constant here, this name. However, the display name naturally can be modified. Next up is the environment ID. And so what we can do is we can use this environment ID to go ahead and retrieve the environment details itself using the Power Platform Admin connector. I will show you that. Also note that this value is also part of our URL. And so the Power Automate service does use a nice RESTful approach to resources, and that makes this quite easy to follow once you actually understand what these values mean behind the scenes. Now, the next thing we're going to be able to track is the run ID. And so this is important. Whenever you go into run history and you click on one of those rows from the table, you're going to find that this run actually shows up here. And this run is something that will allow us to figure out what is the exact run instance. In fact, we could actually retrieve this value here and to be able to prepend essentially our flow URL, and we'd be able to go directly right into our run history itself. So those are some of the attributes that I'm interested in, and I will show you how we can go ahead and retrieve each one of them. So let's go ahead and let's jump into a demo. Okay, so here I am, I'm in my flow. I'm just gonna use a manually trigger a flow just to go ahead and kick this off. Now, this was what I was describing on the slides. I've got my workflow function here. I can find that just by going into expression, typing in workflow. Sure enough, it's right there. And I can go ahead and click OK, and it's going to show up here in my compose. Now, this is going to output that entire JSON message that I showed you in the slides itself. So if we wanted to go ahead and to be able to pick off individual attributes, what we can go ahead and do is basically add our path to it. Now, what this means when you have a question mark there, that's really means it's an optional node. And so if it wasn't found, it shouldn't throw an error. And so that's why we do include the question mark when we refer to this. So what this will mean is that we have the ability to go ahead and basically call the workflow expression and then find the name attribute that is part of what is returned from this expression. So just to help illustrate things, I've got the output of my workflow expression. And so when we look at workflow then name, what we're going to do is go ahead and drag and basically obtain this value right here. Now, I mentioned previously in the slides that this is the value that'll show up in our URL, and sure enough, it does. We've got starting with 36, ending with D3. That is essentially the internal name of our flow, or what's often referred to as our flow ID. So that's how we go ahead and we retrieve that value. And I'm just going to go ahead and set that to a compose value, and then we'll see this in the run history when we go ahead and run it. So next up is the display name. So let's go ahead and click on this. And this JSON path is going to be a little bit different, which is understandable. Here, what we're going to do is we're going to call workflow. Then we're going to go ahead and look for tags. And that's why we've got tags here. And then we're going to go ahead and look for an attribute called flow display name. And sure enough, this is where we'll find get flow metadata. So that's hopefully you're sort of getting the drift now in terms of like how we go ahead and access and traverse this JSON message to pick off the attribute that we're looking for. Let's go after environment ID next. And then let's bring up our cheat sheet here. And so sure enough, we've got workflow tags, right? And then we've got environment name. And so sure enough, that will allow us to go ahead and retrieve the environment name. Now, what's interesting is that's going to return a GUID here, right? If we wanted to go get the display name for this specific value, what we can do is use the get environment as admin action, which is part of our Power Platform admins connector, and pass that in as an input. And when we pass that in as an input, what we're going to do is we're going to get a lot of information about that environment, when it was created, the type of environment it is. We'll also be able to get the display name, which will provide us a user-friendly name that we can leverage. Now, last, we're going to go ahead and see what happens when we get the run instance. And that's going to be down here. So notice we're no longer in the tags node because that ended right here. We are going to now be in the run node. So that's why we're going to have workflow run, and then we're going to go after name. And name is going to allow us to get this specific value. Now, we're not going to see this value show up inside of our URL just yet. If we want to be able to find this one, and it starts in 08 and ends in 02, what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to find this if we go into our run history. And so I've got a few of these that have run, but here's that exact run instance that I had referred to here, right? So if we go ahead and now look at our URL, we've got the environment and the environment ID, flows, the flow ID, and then we've got basically runs, and then this specific instance starts with 08, ends in 02. That is the one that we're after right here. So let's go ahead. Let's just, we'll go ahead now and run this, and then I'll show you the output as a result. Okay, that was pretty quick. Now here, this is going to output our whole workflow expression. So that's where we have all of these different values here. Then we're going to go after our flow ID. So this would be the same, right? Starts with 36, ends in AD3. So there we go. We're able to find that. The display name, it's still called get flow metadata. So that makes sense. Our environment ID starts with 62, ends in DD, starts in 62, ends in DD. And then what we can do is pass that as an input into this specific action, and then we're going to go ahead and get all of this additional information. Now, the display name for this is called DevOps Dev, which we see over here, and then there's also going to be like a linked friendly name as well without the org behind it, so we can find that linked metadata friendly name, DevOps Dev, from that perspective. So that's cool. And then the run instance, this is going to be different than the one that we saw before. It's going to start with 08 and end in 00. And sure enough, if we go to our latest entry, starts with 08, ends in 00. So Hopefully that gives you a good understanding of how you can use the workflow expression. There's a lot of goodies inside of there. And so certainly when you need to capture data about the flow from a runtime perspective, this is a great way to go ahead and do so. All right, so thanks for checking out this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you're not following me on Twitter, go ahead and find me at Weare. And then certainly if you're on YouTube, likes and subscribes are always appreciated. So go ahead and hit that like button, go ahead and add a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.